The next file we want to add to our remote repository is a gitignore file. Gitignore files are really interesting because they're just a simple text file, but they're a list of all of the files, file types, and folders that Git should ignore as it's tracking a repository. That's extremely helpful because you might be using a content management system for like WordPress, for example, that is constantly generating specific files. Or maybe you've got a process running from Node.js or maybe a grunt build where you have log files being created all the time or certain JSON files being created. And you don't want those to keep showing up as modified files or untracked files every time you're running your processes. If you don't need to track those files, if you don't need to version control them, you want Git to ignore them. So you can control exactly what is ignored and what's not. Now, in the last exercise, we created a new README file by simply clicking on a link saying, hey, I want to do a README file. Well, once you do that, or once you start adding some files, those links kind of go away. So when you create a brand new repository, it's a really good idea to go ahead and create a new gitignore file while you're initializing the repository, unless you're doing it locally, for example, or unless you have kind of a favorite gitignore file that you like to use. Now, that doesn't mean that we're stuck, of course. You can open up any text editor, create a gitignore file, and upload it, or we can create files, any type of files, directly from scratch right here within GitHub. And I'm going to show you how to do that as we create a gitignore file. So again, I'm back on my GitHub Basics repository here inside of GitHub. And I notice that right beside the name of the repository here, I have a little plus symbol. And if I hover over that, I can see that that is create a new file. Cool. So I can create a brand new file from scratch. And when I click on that, it opens up basically the same editor that we were using before. And it says, okay, well, what do you want to do? What kind of file is this? So all we have to do is type in a name of the file. And gitignore files always use the same name. It's a .gitignore. And you can tell from my autocomplete that I've already done this once. You may not have that, but that's okay. Now, what's really interesting is that once you type in .gitignore, if you spell it correctly and you have the period at the beginning of it, the far right-hand side over here, you can see GitHub is really smart. It goes, oh, wait, you want to do a gitignore file. Cool. Do you want to use one of our templates? Since GitHub is so widely used by so many different designers and developers all over the world, there have been some standards that people have sort of pushed forth in dealing with gitignore files. And if I grab the pull-down menu here, I can see that there are gitignore files for Android development, from C, C++, C#, Cake, PHP, all that stuff. Now, I'm a web designer. I'm not doing all that junk. But if I scroll down towards the bottom, and please take time to take a look at that list because there's a ton of stuff there, I can see that there is a WordPress template. And I do a good bit of stuff with WordPress, so maybe I want to look at that. Well, if I click on this, it sort of gives me an idea of how a gitignore file would be configured. You'll notice that it's a list of files, or list of file types and folders, and it's just broken by line returns. That's it. You can use wildcards, as you're seeing here. That would ignore all log files. You can do directories. You can see this is going to say, hey, anything in the WP content /uploads /directory. And that would be anything in that directory. Let's go ahead and ignore everything in there. So this is pretty neat. Now, I've actually given you a template for some files that I commonly ignore in Git. And to open this up, I'm going to go into the exercise files. All right, so I'm going to go out to the desktop, to the exercise files that we copied earlier on. I'm going to go to the chapter 3, 0303, and I've got a little text file here called gitignore.txt. I'm going to double-click on that to open it up in a text editor. And I'm just going to copy everything in here. So do a select all and then a copy. Then I'm going to go back to my gitignore, and I'm going to replace all the stuff that I have here by just pasting it. Now, the reason I'm going to do that is because I want to walk you through some of the syntax that you can use when writing a gitignore file. The hashtag here, unlike the README, where with a markdown file, that would become a heading, when we're using just a regular text file, that hash is a comment. So that is ignored. So within a gitignore file, the hash is a comment, and it's a way of sort of writing a note to yourself, basically. So here I would ignore the htaccess file. Notice that I'm ignoring any Photoshop or Illustrator files that are source files. I've got the wildcard character to help me with that. Now, I don't really do a lot of development builds, but I wanted to show you the syntax of this. Whenever you use bracket notation like this is saying both of them. So this is the equivalent, basically, of doing star.o followed by star.a. So you can just do bracket notation, and you can have multiple file types in there. I also find it really helpful to have this dsstore exclusion. Those are hidden files that are included in a lot of Mac directories, and I've noticed a lot of times when I upload files to, say, a Windows-based machine or something like that, those files kind of come along for the ride. So that tells Git to ignore those. I'm also ignoring text files for the most part, unless I have a README file, and that's where this syntax comes in handy. So you can see the little exclamation point in front of readme.txt. That basically says, not this file. Don't ignore this one. So I can say, hey, exclude all text files, but don't exclude any text file called readme.txt. I'm also doing log files, and because I use web fonts so often and they don't really ever change, I usually ignore those as well. And so I can ignore that entire directory by doing an underscore fonts and then a /, and now everything inside that is going to be ignored and it won't show up as untracked files or things like that. Just like when we did a README file, we don't save it, we'll commit it. So I'm going to go down to the bottom. You'll notice it says create gitignore. You can say added files and folders to not track. And then I'm going to go ahead and commit that new file. And you can see it's been added to our repository. There's our gitignore file, and there's our commit. Now, the first time you approach using gitignore, you're probably going to be a little hesitant about it. You're going to be like, well, I don't really know what to ignore and what not to ignore. The more you use GitHub and the more you use Git, you'll get a good feel for what's really important for you to track and the things that are sort of annoying for you to track. And that's going to help form the basis for what you ignore and what you don't. But if you need a little bit of help figuring that out, there is this little section of GitHub called Gist. And if I right-click on this to load that up in its own tab, Gist is basically a way you can save your own code snippets, but they become public as well. So if I go in and search for gitignore within Gists, there are a ton of these. You can see there's actually 6,184 of them, and you can even look by subject matter with some of these. But basically, these are folks that are posting their gitignore files, kind of what they use, some of their favorites. And if you roll through them and read through their comments, you'll learn a lot about gitignore and how to format certain things and maybe how to ignore some of the files that might be right for your own personal workflow. Okay, so that's the basics of adding a gitignore file. I want to point out one more time, make sure that the name of the file starts with a period, so it is .gitignore. And in our next exercise, we're going to continue looking at some of the basics of GitHub. We're going to take a look at how we can edit existing files.